All right, students, welcome to Chapter 30. So let me go over a few things first and foremost. The homework assignment today is simply acknowledge that you read what I posted in the stream. If you failed to read what I posted in the stream, really quickly make sure that you have that PDF copy of Chapter 30 if you don't have your book at home. There are no daily quizzes. All I have assigned is the study guide that's going to be due on Thursday. Thursday is your review day. Friday is your test. Now, this is going to be a 3-day marathon session of getting through Chapter 30. I'm going to be very honest with you. Chapter 30 is set up in a very odd way, and it's kind of hard to get through some of the elements of it. So I'm going to actually focus more on the history portions of it. When it comes to this economic elements, you need to kind of read those in the book, okay? So make sure you are reading corresponding with what we're covering. I'm still going to include the PowerPoints. The PowerPoints have the page numbers where some of the information is located on finding some of these more economic terms that you're going to need to understand, okay? But instead, I'm going to cover, again, like I said, on the historical elements. So as we kind of blitz through the first few slides of this unit, which is basically 30.1, we are instead going to focus more on 30.2. Do not fall behind. If you fall behind, you're going to find yourself in a bad spot because we are going to end homework turn-in dates on the 22nd, so you need to keep this up and going. Make sure you're doing those readings, okay? All right, so let's just get started here. One of the things that we're going to look at here with the 1970s, like 75 into the 80s, is you're going to see a lot of economic issues. So you're going to see problems where it comes to unemployment. You're going to see inflation. When unemployment and inflation hit with each other, it is massively bad for an economy. You're going to see an economy falter, and you're going to see a lot of upset, angry people who cannot find their way to economic security because of dual factors of unemployment not working and cost of goods going up, okay? This also creates business profit issues, which then also further increases unemployment and inflation. One thing that you need to know, things that I have underlined here, ways that governments try to control the economies. That's changing taxes, either raising or lowering them, changing the interest rate through the Federal Reserve, meaning making it cheaper for banks to borrow money to make it cheaper for you to also borrow money, or making it more expensive and harder to loan money so that they get a greater return. And also either regulation or deregulation, mostly deregulation, removing restrictions in order to make things cheaper and easier. Okay, you guys are going to look through the federal budget on your own, okay? And lastly, a problem that's going to impact the United States going into 1975 into the 1980s. You're going to see that there's too big of a dependence on foreign oil, which creates economic crisis. You see problems with foreign governments and foreign economies developing their manufacturing, like in Japan and Korea and in China, which makes goods cheaper to produce over there in comparative to the United States, which then leads companies to buy cheaper foreign manufactured goods, causing, again, loss of American jobs, loss of profits for major corporations. So competition from foreign markets really starts to come into play into the 1970s and well into today's economy even. And that's also with trade deficits. Trade deficits basically means we are buying stuff from another country. So for example, like China, we buy more stuff from China than we sell back to them. So we have a big trade deficit between them because we are spending much more money than they are buying from us. So trade deficits also become an issue. All these pages are along the top here with it. Read those sections. Let's just jump into 30.2 here, okay? With Gerald Ford is seen as pretty ineffective in general. First off, he pardons Nixon, which first makes him very unpopular among the American people because they want to know all the crimes and problems that were committed. Ford basically said to the American people, he goes, if I allow these lawsuits to go forward and all these investigations, 99% of my time would be focusing on investigating Nixon compared to running the country. However, this still created ill will. Furthermore, Ford runs headfirst into but inflation of a large magnitude. Hyperinflation is really, really, really bad. That only happens usually in third world countries. But just standard inflation, you start to see the cost of goods go up all over the place. The average middle American sees that his buying power reduces immensely once inflation starts to rise. Everything that Ford tries and Congress tries to do is basically ineffective. The democratically controlled Congress tries to push a number of bills to help try to improve the economy, and Ford basically rejects every single one of them but one. So he is not seen as being able to control these economic problems. So when he goes up and he has to run against Jimmy Carter, Ford looks inept. And not to be rude to Ford, but Ford really didn't come off as being the brightest president as there was either. He had a lot of other problems and goofs and gaffes, and he was notorious for falling down over things. So he didn't have a positive image. With the Democrats in general, because of the ineptness of Ford and the scandals of Nixon, it pretty much looked like they could have taken this election no matter what. And with Ted Kennedy being taken off the ticket due to some indiscretions and issues on his part, if you guys are interested in it, look it up on your own. But Carter really comes out of almost nowhere. He's a independent businessman, runs a peanut farm, and he's very quiet, very moralistic. So he actually wins, and surprisingly, he should have won by a larger margin, but he barely kind of beats Ford out. And he kind of lacks a massive personality, a massive presence. And that's one thing about him is, again, he's raised from a very religious background. He's very nice. He's very polite. He's very down to earth. One of the famous things about him, of course, is that when he's inaugurated, he doesn't take the presidential limo to the White House. He actually walks there. He kind of moves himself in. He's seen as frugal when it comes to the people's money, doing things like selling a presidential yacht. So he's very personable, very likable from a general level. But at the same time, you don't necessarily want that as the leader of your country when you need to deal with hostile foreign governments, especially during the Cold War. But one thing also about Carter is, after he's president, he does a lot of really great humanitarian efforts and projects. He's probably one of the finest examples of a great ex-president. He's really just a nice, humble human being. He's very likable up front. And so he's just kind of a friendly guy that everybody likes. But again, he does things even to the point like where he addresses the American people. He wears a sweater instead of a suit. And again, he seems just kind of as a soft, incompetent person, though. And one of the other problems is that he runs face first into still a massive recession that is hitting him. And it's almost knee deep into a depression because the economic situation of America has been propped up artificially through artificial pricing placed on oil and on other consumer products that eventually just comes to a head and blows up in his face. One of the things, if you look at employment in the 1970s, remember I talked about cheaper manufacturing done overseas and competition from there? Japan really pushes this out there. They make steel cheaper. They start to make cars that are more fuel efficient, and with the massive gasoline shortages that start to come out during this time frame, their cars are starting to be bought up in greater numbers. One of the things that you look at when it comes to these economic disparities, people who worked in industrial jobs and worked in car factories had really good unions that backed them. These people were making massive amounts of money. When it's comparative to like a somewhat modern view, a lot of factory workers were making as much money as what you'd consider like a mid-level lawyer. That's how much money they were making. They had 2 cars. They often had a vacation home. Many of them had boats. Some of them made so much money that they could pay off their mortgages in 7 years. That's how profitable and how financially secure the American manufacturing sector was during the 1950s into the 1970s. You had middle-class people that were well above traditional middle class if they worked in these jobs. Once they went away, these people lost those jobs and they never recovered that buying and spending power. They just became this giant void in the market where all these consumer goods used to be able to be purchased, now we're gone. Again, also artificial inflation of gas, artificial depreciation of gas prices drove eventually to the gas shortages. But you lose a lot of employment, and then you talk to a group of people who will never be able to re-engage that buying power again. That creates massive economic stress, and that's what happens on here. It got so bad that even cities like New York City were almost bankrupt. They asked the federal government for a bailout. Ford told them to take a hike. I think the famous New York headline was New York asked for a bailout. Ford says drop dead, something like that. Eventually, they had to correct their own financial situation. But this shows you the economic issues that start to happen throughout the country. And so when you look at the number of Americans that leave the manufacturing sector and just don't recover those jobs, again, drives economic problems. You see inflation start to move up. 10% inflation rates start to hit here. And this just raises the goods of everything. If you have inflation, it reduces your buying power, plain and simply. So if you're making $1 an hour, and like the example here is a Coke, if you're making $1 an hour, you used to be able to buy one Coke for every hour that you worked. Once it hits $1.10, you now have to work just a little bit harder, and you lose some of that buying power that you used to have. And that starts to happen on products such as sugar, flour, and any consumer goods all start to go up during the 1970s. And Americans start to really feel that crunch. They start to lose high-paying jobs, and now things cost more. And so Americans really start to look to Carter to try to find some sort of solution, but nothing comes out of it. Also, in the 1970s, the United States was supporting Israel pretty heavily. And if you guys remember about oil manufacturing and OPEC is mainly run by Arab countries. You do have people like Venezuela that become part of OPEC, but for the most part, most of them are run by Middle Eastern countries. And in retaliation for supporting Israel, they start to raise oil prices. At one point, they jump oil prices up by 75%, and then shortly thereafter by 125%. And when Nixon saw this, he decides to put price caps on. So he artificially deflates the price of oil, and people understood that this was an artificial drop and that the gasoline was being artificially priced low, which leads a run to people getting gas because they try to buy as much cheap gas as they can in order to fill up in their cars. However, the oil producers are not going to buy more oil and charge at this low rate by not being able to be profitable. So eventually oil supplies start to dry up, and so do gasoline supplies. And pretty soon you start to see people stuck in gas rationing. As you can see, up in that corner there, 10 gallons of gas per customer. There'd be times where you go to the gas station and there's no gas whatsoever. This again hurts the American manufacturing economy because remember, we were talking about vehicles, and American vehicles had historically been large and used large amounts of gasoline, where these new cars coming out of Japan and Korea were small, light, and had better fuel economy. So people start buying the cheaper cars that get better fuel economy, further creating problems in the manufacturing districts in Detroit. More people start losing their jobs. Again, foreign competition. And so another thing too is that Iran, who'd been run by the Shah of Iran, we backed up and supported, was in the midst of having to contend with a revolution in his government. And eventually, once that revolution happens, the Iranian oil completely dries up, further plunging us into issues with gasoline shortages. So what was wrong with what happened to Carter? Overall, there's him in his nice little sweater having those fireside chats with the American people. He just didn't really have any way to fix inflation or unemployment. Now, admittedly, we like to talk about presidents having a lot of impact on the economy. They usually don't. More than anything, often that's Congress who has those responsibilities by passing spending and regulation laws and also helping to reduce regulations that allow for manufacturers to make things cheaper and more efficiently. With more onerous regulations, usually the more it costs to produce goods within the country itself. So overall, he gets blamed for it. But again, talking economics is a very tricky thing because people truly believe that there is so much pressure that you can put on on the president saying he has all this power to control it, when in fact lots of it falls on Congress too. And so both of them were fairly ineffective of even trying to deal with it. And it's not like Jimmy Carter had a hostile Congress. He had one that was held up by his own political party. They just could not seem to find the solution, the trick to fix the economy and get it repaired again. Also, a few things too that he had a problem with is that we're going to talk about it here in just a minute with the Iran hostage crisis. With his inability to figure out and how to solve it correctly, that also made him look weak on the world stage and ineffective, which allows Reagan to eventually take over, beat him in the election and take over as president. All right, so let's talk really quickly about Iran. We're not going to cover this whole section here. Basically, the Shah of Iran had been propped up by the American government for quite some time. We bought oil from him cheaply. He bought a lot of military weapons from us. So it was a win-win scenario for both parties. However, the Shah was definitely not a good guy, and he was a brutal dictator. Eventually, people got sick of it, and they started a revolution. This is where you see the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who eventually overthrows the government of Iran and takes control and creates an Islamic government, which is very stringent and religious in nature. It is very anti-American also. If you go to Iran even today, you can see a lot of the artwork still from the Iranian Revolution that says "Death to America." Basically, Iran went from being one of our best friends in the Middle East to our biggest enemy. And even still to this day, we do not get along with them economically and politically. So they have a lot of problems with each other still to this day. During the hostage crisis, we see that there's 52 Americans held hostage. Initially, it was like 64, but some of them were released, like women and sickly people were released. And they were held for 444 days. And as soon as Reagan became president, Iran knew that they were dealing with a much stronger person that would probably wage unrelenting, horrible war upon him, and released all the hostages. Jimmy Carter does make a pseudo attempt at trying to rescue the hostage, but he doesn't commit enough manpower and equipment to it. And the rescue attempt fails in the desert. There's a lot of problems with the helicopters, and so he doesn't firmly commit a large military force that would need to be actually used in order to convince the Iranians to release the hostage to the extent that it needed to be done. Again, problem with Carter is he wasn't willing to commit enough to do things. He was always taking half measures. It's one of his problems that he has. Let's talk about some of his successes, though, or at least what he's perceived as being successful at. This, again, creates some problems and dilemmas. So the first thing is he looks at, remember we talked about Nixon showing up in China and building economic relationships. Carter takes another approach where he says if you are engaged in civil rights abuses and civil rights problems, which, again, morally, it's a great idea here. He's a very moral person, very strong convictions. And so he tells many countries, shape up, or we're not going to do business with you and we're not going to give you aid. He does this to a number of even South American countries where he says, your government is dangerous and violent and is oppressing people. We're not going to give you any financial aid. And he cuts it off. He starts to take a stronger position in areas like in Africa where you have the governments that are white segregational governments where only white people can have power and they suppress the African Americans in those countries. So he really brings this to light, and he takes a very strong stand against governments that are abusive to their people. So again, very moralistic and very high-minded ideals. And sometimes it's very positive, but at the same time, sometimes you need to have some governments that are not always the best to have your back in some situations. One thing, though, that he's also great at is he brings the president of Egypt and the prime minister of Israel together, and they start to have open and active dialogue. And for the first time, Egypt recognizes Israel as its own independent nation state. It also allows Israel to open up more freedom of government of the Palestinians. And so you start to see a relative peace start to formulate between Israel and Egypt. And Egypt was often an aggressor or part of the aggressors that attacked Israel. And so the Camp David Accords are seen as fairly successful until the Egyptian president goes back home and he gets assassinated for showing support in this Camp David Accords. The SALT II treaty negotiations start up between the Soviet Union and the United States. They seem to come to an agreement. However, shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. The Senate decides at that point they don't want to even try to get into the SALT agreements because if you guys remember about United States government structures, that the Senate has to approve all treaties, and Carter was never able to get the approval from the Senate, and he eventually also pulls it out after what happens in Afghanistan. All right, so that ends the Carter administration for you guys. I'm sorry, it's really, really long. Tomorrow we're going to talk about Reagan, and make sure you guys continue working on those study guides. That's the only homework I'm going to be giving you guys, to be working on those, okay? All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow.